Pirate Freedom is a 2007 pirate adventure novel by Gene Wolfe. And just as with any book by Gene Wolfe, it is told in the first person and is full of twists and turns and things that you really don't expect coming. And more than that, this book ends in such a way that you almost need to pick it up right away and reread it in order to understand what was really going on all along. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experience with this book, as it was my first novel of Gene Wolfe's that wasn't in his New Sun series, and also a little bit of what this book is about. So to begin with, Pirate Freedom begins in the modern day with our main character, his name is Chris, being a Catholic priest, and he hears the confession of a man who claims to be a murderer, and Chris shares with him that he also has murdered people before, and the majority of the book Pirate Freedom serves as a first-hand account and almost a confession from Chris about how that happened and what the circumstances were of that murder, and obviously many, many more details as well. So the way that the main story goes is that Chris tells the story of, as a young boy, he and his father moved to, I believe it was Cuba, and there are some hints that Chris's father may have been in the Mafia. It's not really quite clear, but certainly involved in some shady underhanded practices, and he kind of shunts Chris off into a Catholic school, where Chris attends for many years, and then eventually Chris is given the option to stay and become a full member of the Catholic school, or to move out on his own. And Chris decides to leave. And as he leaves, he realizes that he has been gradually transported back through time and is now in the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean islands. And as the title implies, Chris eventually finds himself out at sea and finds himself part of a pirate crew, which he's initially very resistant to joining. And gradually, as the story goes on, it's unclear whether he becomes more comfortable with being a part of the pirate crew or if he just adapts to it, and his adventures go from there, eventually working his way up through the rankings of the pirate crew. There are battles fought, treasure is found, lady loves that are won, and a lot of very typical things that you would expect from a pirate adventure, yet all of this told through Gene Wolfe's specific lens. And you can tell right from the beginning that this is not a normal pirate story, if for no other reason than it begins with our main character time traveling into the past to the golden age of piracy. It's not clear whether the present-day story is literally present-day or some semi-futuristic version of present-day, but throughout the story, throughout the account, Chris actually will tell us a little bit of what's going on currently. He'll tell us about what he was doing at the local church. He'll recount different portions of sermons that he has preached recently, or different encounters he's had with other Catholic priests and so on. And so these flashes forward give us a bit of a picture of what is happening currently while he's writing out his own confession here. So already that's odd. That's not your normal Treasure Island on Stranger Tides type pirate story. There's time travel that's involved here. And some people might consider this a spoiler, but I don't know necessarily that it is. It becomes clear throughout the book that Chris is not the only time traveler in this story. And one of the big things that you can pick up on is, and here we'll get into a little bit about the writing craft here, Gene Wolfe is famous for his prose and his absolutely meticulous writing. And in Pirate Freedom, he shows that he has a very clear understanding of a lot of minuscule details of how running a ship in the 1800s, what that entailed. He has a lot of terminology that went way over my head. He knows a lot of very specific details that really add a feeling of immersion and verisimilitude to the story. And yet at the same time, Chris speaks like somebody from the 21st century. The book was written in 2007. Chris talks like that. He speaks in very anachronistic dialogue, very modern dialogue. He'll say things like, "what the heck?" or other modern phrases that would seem very out of place, even in something as silly as Pirates of the Caribbean. It would feel very out of place, and yet, because Chris is from the future, traveling back in time, that's why he talks like that. And if you pay attention, there are a couple of few key other characters, one in specific that comes to mind, who also speaks in very seemingly anachronistic dialogue. So a little bit of other things that I'd like to point out about Gene Wolfe's writing here is, I'd like to talk about this in conversation with Book of the New Sun. So in case you're not familiar with Book of the New Sun, there's other videos on my channel that will address it, so I'll speak more generally about it. So if you're lost, my apologies, but there's other resources out there. The story of Book of the New Sun is told by Severian, who claims to have a perfect memory and is the sitting emperor autarch of the Commonwealth of Earth. Okay, so there's a lot of people who suspect in Book of the New Sun that Severian is either omitting things, which becomes pretty clear, or that he might even be out and out lying about things. Now, this is very interesting to contrast Severian as a narrator to Chris. Chris does not claim to have a perfect memory. In fact, there are multiple times where he'll say, I don't exactly remember what happened here, or he'll admit his own shortcomings. But just like Severian, he is very unflinching in presenting many of his own weaknesses and many of his own failings. But unlike Severian, Chris has a moral duty in many ways to not lie, a moral onus upon him, because he is a priest and because he's giving a confession in this story. It really is his duty. It wouldn't be a confession if he were lying about what he's doing. And yet, as the story goes on, there are more and more details that seem like maybe he is omitting things. Maybe he's not quite the morally upright priest that we first suspected. And here we'll get a little bit into character. So one of the big questions when reading a Gene Wolfe book, people ask, can you trust the narrator? And that's about as simple of a question as saying, can you trust any single person in life? Everybody views life from their own perspective, and it is so as well with Gene Wolfe's narrators. But specifically with Father Chris in Pirate Freedom, there is a very odd play that is going on in his internal character. Wolfe doesn't write in a flowery, overly emotional way. Much of the characterization comes through how the characters view the world and how they write about it. So for Chris, especially early on, he'll talk about, he'll get into dangerous situations and he's counting up different, the men who are involved, or he's looking for escape routes in case things go wrong. And that tells you something about his character. But also, Chris has a much more grounded sense of morality at times. For example, he gets roped into dealing with slaves at times, and he tries to deal with them humanely, see if there's a way he can help them escape. So things that other pirates would see as irrelevant or wouldn't care about, he seems to have moral feelings about. And yet at other times, he speaks very callously of some of the very, very brutal things that his pirate crew does. And even though he does not state that he is actively engaging in some of these evil behaviors, he's still complicit, he's still standing by. And it's also tricky, similar to Severian, because Chris is so honest about times where he does mess up and some of the big failings in his character. I mean, this whole book is written as a confession specifically around one murder that happens about halfway through the book. It is also tricky to see if maybe he is lying about stuff, as I said a second ago. So one of the famous examples of this is there's a time where he is put in a very vulnerable position with a woman. And this is kind of a typical Wolfe setup. This is not original to, if you've read any Wolfe stories, that, his character is alone with a beautiful woman. I wonder what's going to happen now. And yet, Father Chris insists that he only kissed her a few times and nothing else happened. And he's very adamant about this point. And yet afterwards, this woman who's a native island dweller of where where Chris is at that point in the story, that woman is very confused and seems to think that she is now Chris's wife. And so there seems to be an indication, did Chris misunderstand something, or did he actually go full on and have relations with this woman and is now lying to us about it because that would paint him in a more negative light? So the morality of, is Father Chris a good guy or a bad guy, is very unclear. And at first it seems pretty obvious. And then as you get through the book, it's like, well, maybe this is a bit more shady. And as you get towards the end of the story, the reveals that Wolfe gives, even in the very last pages of this book, recontextualize a whole lot about this story. I should have said this much earlier on in the video, but as with every Wolfe story, you have to read to the ending. You actually don't know what the story is about until you get to the ending, and then Wolfe gives you a hint that will help you see the story in a completely different light, and that is certainly true here with Pirate Freedom. And so even though you have Father Chris seeming to excuse or brush away sins or not want you to think about it, you also have very powerful statements at other points in the book about his relationship with God, or his view of God, or his desire to seek God. For example, the book opens up with this, where he's talking about getting home from the youth center where he works. And he says, he's talking about his evenings, he says, "I read whenever I can the lives of good and decent men and women who sought God and found him. I'm not like that. Either I've never lost him, or I have never sought him. When you read this, you can say which. I have already confessed many times, but I think someone ought to tell my story. I am no autobiographer, just the only one who knows it." And that really encapsulates the story very well. It's unclear whether he never lost God or whether he's never sought him in the first place. I should say, at least for a first reading, it's unclear. And that will make it an even more fascinating read going through it again a second time of where does Chris's morality line up with his Catholic beliefs that he claims to have? One of the more controversial points in this book is where Chris is in the modern day, and he recounts an incident where he was at a church sort of panel discussion, and they're talking about different scandals in the Catholic Church and young men who've been abused by evil, corrupt priests. And Chris makes the argument that actually some of this responsibility falls on people who have not taught these boys properly that violence is acceptable in certain situations to defend yourself from evil. And people have read this as Gene Wolfe victim blaming, which I think is a preposterous take, especially since Gene Wolfe is famous for writing beliefs that are not his own into his first person narrators. But so it might be more accurate to say that Chris is victim blaming by saying, well, these boys just should have known how to fight. But even so, I don't necessarily think that's perfectly fair either. Wolfe is sort of infamous in Book of the New Sun for a particularly disturbing assault of one of the main characters by Severian, and one of the female characters, I should say. And it's interesting that we almost have an inversion of that in Pirate Freedom very early on, when Chris, being a young boy, probably young on the teenager side of things, like 15 or 16, when he gets part of a pirate crew, is assaulted several times. Now, Wolfe is never graphic about these things. He's always very tasteful, but when Chris later in life is saying these boys should be taught how to defend themselves, this is coming from the place of one who has survived assault and abuse like this. And so that's the context there. But once again, this is not a morally clear stance that Chris is taking. It's somewhat ambiguous of, number one, what Wolfe is trying to say here, but also where Chris falls in terms of right and wrong, both in our perceptions and also in context with his Catholic faith, which really makes this, in many ways, a very deep book to think about a lot of the questions that Wolfe raises here. There's even one sequence in the book here where Chris is encountering a difficult situation, and he actually believes that he has heard an audible voice from God. And here's what the passage from the book says. "That was the only time in my life I have heard the voice of God. He answered me not in my mind or my heart or in my soul. He spoke out loud, and his voice was wonderful in a way that there are no words for. What he said was, 'Love me, Chris, and all else will follow.'" Obviously, for any believing or practicing Catholic, that's a powerful moment, and yet it's unclear whether Chris actually follows that voice that he hears. And once again, as with many Wolfe narrators, it's unclear whether Chris is just completely insane and is writing this out of his own insanity. That's always a possibility, although I don't think it's necessarily a very interesting possibility. In the end, I think Pirate Freedom is absolutely a 5-star novel, for me at least. This is not the most entertaining Gene Wolfe book that I've read. I think you miss some of his really fascinating world building that's in the Book of the New Sun book, so if you're asking me where to start with Wolfe, I would start with that over pirate freedom. However, if for some reason you have an aversion to his world building or to science fiction, then you can give pirate freedom a shot. Even though it's science fiction, historical fiction, it definitely reads like historical fiction. You get Wolfe's prose, his attention to detail. If you're simply looking for, I want to feel emotionally overwhelmed by how amazing these characters are, Wolfe doesn't write in an overly emotional style. You have to read between the lines. You have to actually look at how the characters are talking to get their characterization. A couple pieces of advice about reading this book, though. One is, look out for references to the Mafia, or so-called wise guy characters, because that will end up being important. Two is, as with Wolfe's other works, don't take a lot of time reading this. I'm not saying rush through this, but read it consistently. The more breaks that you take, the more difficult it'll be to pick up Wolfe's continuous train of thought and figure out the points that he's making and how everything's connecting together, because a lot of things are really interconnected in this book. It's just things from the beginning to the very end, and if there's big breaks in between there, well, it breaks up the story. I actually DNF'd this book the first time I tried reading it. Got about 100 pages in and realized I'd spaced out my readings of it too much and just wasn't tracking with it, so gave it a few months and then read it again. And I'm really glad I did. I'm really glad that I got to read another Gene Wolfe book. He is one of my favorite authors, and I'm glad that Book of the New Sun wasn't just a fluke, that he actually does write really excellent other stuff. That is rereadable, and will give you a completely different experience on a reread. And I probably won't reread it just yet, but I'm definitely keeping my copy around because I think it'll be worthwhile. So anyway, guys, I recommend you read Pirate Freedom. If you're looking for a reason to start Wolfe and for some reason this interests you more than other ones, then yeah, read it. It's dark at times. It can be very funny at times. Wolfe's prose and his historical attention to detail is excellent. And there's a lot to think about, both about religion and violence especially, and also the nature of truth, which is a pretty universal theme for Wolfe. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and hope you all are reading Gene Wolfe. And if you're not, you should.